Welcome back to another podcast under Energonomics series. I'm Richa Mishra, and my guest today is Mr. Arun Kumar Singh, former Indian ambassador to the US between 2015 and 16. Before taking charge as the ambassador in the US, he served as ambassador of India to France. He had previously served as deputy chief of mission in the embassy at Washington, D.C., ambassador to Israel, and as joint secretary to the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. So, sir, thank you so much for joining us and sparing this time. As we all have been seeing that there has been very challenging situations which India has been facing as far as the geopolitical developments are concerned. Given this setup and this situation which India is in, vis-a-vis US particularly, which once upon a time was seen as a good friend, over the years things have changed. My first question to you, sir, is that is India better positioned today in negotiating with the US?
So I think for the last couple of days, the tone and tenor of the discussions between the two countries has moved in a little more positive direction. Of course, overall, as you indicated, we are certainly facing a difficult moment in the relationship. There's tensions related to trade. US has imposed 50% tariffs on supplies of goods from India, 25% citing our tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and 25% saying that India is buying oil from Russia, which they would not like. So that's the ground on which they've done it. And then some of the language coming out of Washington was certainly very negative, perhaps even provocative and not acceptable. President Trump spoke about the Indian economy being a dead economy, which is contrary to the facts because India is the fastest growing economy. And they're basically saying that unless India took steps to cut down oil purchases from Russia, they would impose high tariffs. But if you saw on Friday, President Trump posted on social media and commented, basically saying that he valued the India relationship. He was confident that the two countries would come out of this situation. And there are, when they have moments on occasion. And the Prime Minister had responded to that. And then again, he put on the social media on Monday that the trade negotiations are continuing. And he was confident that they will reach a successful conclusion. So clearly, I think both sides are making a very determined effort to bring in the positive elements in the relationship. And as I see it, I think some of the steps that the US has taken, certainly from the Indian point of view, is not justified. If you look at the tariffs US has placed, citing trade grounds, 25%. Now, India was the first country with which the current Trump administration started detailed negotiations on trade. The Indian Prime Minister had visited the US in the middle of February. And in the joint statement that was issued, it was a very, very ambitious joint statement where they defined the relationship as US-India Compact for the 21st century. And Compact was elaborated as catalyzing opportunity for military partnership, accelerated commerce, and technology. There, they also committed to start negotiations on a multi-sectoral bilateral free trade agreement, and that by the year 2030, they would take overall trade to a level of $500 billion from the current level of $200 billion. So that was the kind of projection. And both countries entered into serious negotiations. From what has come out in the public domain, they had 5 rounds of in-person meetings, some of them extending for up to a week. There were more than 40 rounds of virtual discussions. And a fair, balanced trade agreement with benefits for both sides, from again with the reports that have come out, was broadly worked out by the beginning of July. But in between, 2 issues intervened, which made it complicated. The first was that in May, we had the conflict with Pakistan for about 4 days. And President Trump has been very keen to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And he felt that this was going to be an opportunity for him to claim that he has brought about the ceasefire between India and Pakistan, and therefore, additional claim for his getting the Nobel Peace Prize. So he made that claim and he's repeated it some 50 times. And India's position has been very clear since 1972 that there is no scope for any third-party role on India-Pakistan issues. And that's not something that India can walk back from. So given that, starting around 10th of May or so, there's an element of irritation, friction coming in the relationship, driven by President Trump's personal ambitions and his domestic politics. The second thing that happened was that around the time that the India-US trade agreement was broadly worked out at the level of the negotiators, the other partners of the United States were caving in to US demands. And US was claiming that it was making unilateral gains in those trade negotiations without giving in anything from their side. Now, if you look at, for example, Indonesia and Vietnam, the US claimed that they had completely opened up their markets. There would be zero tariff for US products, and US still imposed 20% tariffs on them. Whereas, as far as the EU was concerned, US claimed that they were opening up their markets, they were cutting down on tariffs, and they had committed to invest $600 billion in the US and $750 billion worth of energy purchases from the US, and still US imposed 15% tariffs on them. And similarly with Japan, Japan committed to invest $550 billion in the US. And US claimed that Japan would make available this money. President Trump would decide where it would be invested. And a large part, after a while, almost 90% of the profit generated would go to the US Treasury and not to Japan. And then still he imposed 15% tariffs on Japan. So various reasons, either because of export dependence on US or because of their dependence on US for security reasons, many of the other partners unilaterally caved in to US demands. Now, compared to that, the agreement that was worked out for India, certainly very forward-leaning agreement from the kind of positions that India had taken earlier, was seen as broadly balanced with benefit for both sides. So President Trump could not claim that there were unilateral gains for him. So he didn't accept it, and he went ahead and imposed 25% tariffs. And then the other dimension that happened is that President Trump has been claiming that he will end the Russia-Ukraine war in 24 hours. Or that President Putin will do a deal, because President Trump has been asking for it. He met President Putin in Alaska also. But there is no imminent prospect of a resolution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. So President Trump is coming under criticism in the United States for not taking any action against Russia as the Russia-Ukraine conflict is getting prolonged. And for various reasons, he has not taken any action against Russia since becoming president, either because he wants to continue discussion with Russia or whatever be the reason. China buys more energy from Russia than India does. And yet President Trump felt that he was in no position to put additional tariffs on China because China has shown countervailing power. China has restricted exports of magnets, rare earths, critical minerals. And President Trump felt that that would have a negative impact on US production. And also when he had raised tariffs very high at one point of time, the US bond market had got destabilized. So he was not confident about raising tariffs on China. So given some of the difficulty that there were already in the US-India trade negotiation and his inability to take specific measures against Russia, he decided that perhaps he could put additional measures against India and claim that he was taking action against Russia. So he added another 25% tariffs. If you would have seen recently during the visit of the Polish president to the United States, a journalist asked President Trump that how is it that you're not putting any sanctions on Russia and the Russia-Ukraine conflict is continuing? And he said, how can you say that? I put sanctions on India for purchasing energy from Russia. And another dimension that has come in is many have argued in the US that President Trump has no authority to impose tariffs, and that authority belongs to the US Congress. Several courts have ruled that President Trump does not have that authority. And so now the matter is before the US Supreme Court. And if you see the filing that the US administration has done before the Supreme Court, they have claimed specifically that the administration has imposed tariffs on India to put pressure on Russia to try and get resolution of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, arguing that tariffs are being used not just for trade, but for foreign policy purposes. And in the US system, the president certainly has a mandate on foreign policy issues. So given all that, I think it's largely driven by the domestic politics of President Trump that we are faced with this situation. But I would say that US is much more than Trump. And there are a lot of stakeholders in the US system who do not agree with the action that President has taken. The House Foreign Affairs Committee Democrats have come out with a statement criticizing the president. Several former officials, members of Congress, writers in the think tank community, they've all come out now with statements criticizing the action that US administration has taken. So I think there is a recognition in the US that they have perhaps pushed India too much. India, we cannot compromise on the kind of issues they have raised, and if they don't change their approach, it will. It's not just having an impact on India. They will be negatively impacting the US-India relationship. In effect, they will be sanctioning not India, but the US-India relationship. And that will have negative consequences also for the US. So I think there's a recognition of that. So that's why the tone has changed now. But let's see how the negotiations proceed in the coming weeks and months.
I'm so glad that you brought up the issue of his toning down in the last few days, which we have seen. Now, the contradictory signals which keeps coming from the US, given that situation, what I wanted to understand from you is that where are we actually headed as far as our bilateral ties are concerned? Can US be the trusted ally which it was once upon a time looking like?
First, in the US relationship, we have never used the word ally. We've always spoken of partnerships, and India does not believe in alliances, and certainly not, of course, in military alliances. Second, I think from my own experience, I have found that Indian policymakers always recognize that any country takes decisions based on its own interest or the political interests of its leaders, not so as to help another country. And that the US at any point of time will be taking decisions based on its perception of its own interests, not to help India. And therefore that can change. For example, if we were to tell the US that you should not have any relationship with Pakistan because Pakistan supports terrorism, will the US listen to India? They will not. They will have a relationship with Pakistan based on their own perception of what it means for them. There have been difficulties in the US-Pakistan relationship when they have felt that Pakistan is acting in a manner that is adversarial to the US. When that is not so, they will have a relationship with Pakistan. So given that, I think basic assessment has to be that any given moment, how is the domestic politics playing out in the US? What is their overall global priority? And in the framework of that, what is the convergence between Indian and US interests? And you have to work on that basis, rather than expecting that US will take decisions to be helpful to India. And similarly, the US should not expect that just because they want something, India will naturally go along with them. They should make allowance for India to take decisions based on assessment of its own interests. And that is a far stronger basis for any relationship to progress in a positive direction.
So, but as I've been observing and as an outsider, I can say that this time around, the narrative of the Indian government also across ministries, across departments has been the same. Everyone has been speaking the same language. Maybe so because the Foreign Affairs Ministry has been more in command of the situation, because there were times when the Petroleum Ministry had its own narrative and the Foreign Ministry had its own narrative. But this time around, it seems India's, the approach is more concrete and we know what we want. I mean, economy definitely is taking. Why I'm coming to this question is, sir, because you have had in your career opportunity to deal with EU also. And, you have been involved, you have been at the main positions there as well. So when we are dealing with EU, the narrative is a little different than when you're dealing with someone like US. So in this whole thing, in your diplomatic career and what you see today, has things changed, sir? Has something evolved over the years in India's own diplomatic approach?
No, I think my own sense is that at any point of time, diplomats working on behalf really of the government, I mean, they don't decide on their own. On behalf of the government, basically try and make an assessment of where does India's interest lie, and then follow policies on that basis. And the European Union, again, is an important partner. It has, as a collective, as much GDP as the United States has, and it's an important trading partner. France is a very important strategic partner for India, with cooperation in defense, civil nuclear energy, and space. But the challenge in Europe is that Europe is today very fragmented. To arrive at consolidated European positions can be difficult. Germany has been weakened with the conflict going on between Russia and Ukraine. You are seeing the problems in France. They have not had a stable government now for some time. So European countries are divided in their approach, and I think in the current situation, they are also very worried about continued U.S. commitment to transatlantic security. And if that comes down, then the European countries again will have to revise their approach in terms of how they deal with the challenge as they see it from Russia, and how do they manage the need to increase defense expenditure when all of them are facing budgetary pressures and huge deficits. So they are going through their own set of challenges.
So, on a light note, others will take it as a serious thing, but we are quite cynical about it, not critical about it, that we'll ever see China, Russia, India getting together. Thankfully, because of President Trump, we saw a little of these three getting together in the current situation.
Well, I think that was more an optics aspect than, on substantive issues, there are challenges. Ultimately, as you know, India's articulated policy is strategic autonomy of its decision making.
Right.
That it should be able to take decisions on any issue based on its own assessment of its interests. Now, having said that, Russia certainly is a very important partner for India, very important defense partner, today very important energy partner. But in civilian areas of technology, and if you look at the market size, Russia doesn't compare with the US or European market. And if you look at China, it's now today a leading global manufacturer, leading in many technology areas, and the largest trading partner, more than 100 countries. So certainly one can make the case that it would be useful to engage with the Chinese technology manufacturing ecosystem. But that having been said, even as one does that engagement, you have always to be mindful about what would be the security implication for India. Because there are security-related challenges now embedded in the modern technologies. So that is something that will always be at the back of your mind. So given all that, US will remain a necessary partner for India. Is the largest trading partner, largest in terms of investment flows in both directions. At 5.4 million, the largest single country presence of Indian origin diaspora. At 300,000, largest single country presence of Indian students in US universities. So US will remain a necessary partner, and therefore there is no question of making an either or choice. That I don't think will work for India.
My last question to you would be, sir, that as a diplomat, when you were dealing with the fraternity there in US, what kind of approach, what kind of thinking goes behind, sir, when you people are dealing with them?
No, basically, you have to understand each society. You have to understand the politics of each society. You have to understand what are the decision points in each society, and given that, see what you can do to pursue India's interests. And US normally has been a very demanding framework within which to operate, because you have the administration. Even in the administration, you have the presidency, you have different departments. Then you have the Congress. And the US Congress sees itself as a co-equal branch of government. That's the normal situation. Then you have courts, you have media, you have think tanks, you have businesses, you have regions, and you have to engage with all the stakeholders. But today the situation is very different. The manner in which President Trump dominates the base and is dominating the politics, that Republicans in US Congress are going along entirely with him. So Congress is today not really functioning as a co-equal branch of government. So the kind of institutional checks and balances that were there in the US system earlier are not operating. So I think people who are there today are operating in a very different context and different environment than those who may have been operating before Trump came in for his second term. So basically, you have to work out what is the context within which you're operating and decide your strategies based on that.
It is a pleasure talking to you, sir. Thank you for giving us this time.